In my last lecture, we saw John Stuart Mill defend utilitarianism's greatest happiness principle against some of the problems that inevitably surface when one claims it essential to ethics. When one claims, in other words, that ethical living boils down to acting so as to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. First, we saw Mill defend against the fear that such a base for morality will turn ethics into something like a cocaine-sniffing, high-rolling Vegas vacation. Second, Mill showed us that despite Bentham's admittedly intimidating mathematics, we need not actually learn statistics in order to make decent ethical decisions. Last, Mill proved that utilitarian ethics can in fact be sanctioned, that there is, in other words, more reason to adhere to the greatest happiness principle than our own base desires. Mill clearly needed to deal with these problems. However, they were small potatoes compared to the issues we're going to be talking about today. Indeed, in the latter chapters of utilitarianism, Mill deals not with the problems that follow from accepting utilitarian ethics, but rather with the accuracy of utilitarianism's central claim itself, the claim that happiness is the only good. The difference here is thus like that between convincing a friend that the latest Die Hard was a good movie and convincing that same friend that the latest Die Hard sets the new standard by which all past and future movies must be measured. In these last chapters, then, since Mill is making something like this second claim in regards to happiness, he must consider other things that have claimed to be good in themselves and show why they are not, why happiness is the only good in itself, the only standard of goodness. The first of these contenders is something we will be covering in a couple weeks, virtue. The second we have already covered in depth, goodwill, and the third is the rather familiar concept of justice. Let's look at these one at a time. First then, virtue. Although we have yet to discuss virtue in depth, there is no need to do so right now. Virtue for Mill is really no different than what we refer to as virtue in everyday speech. It is simply the character trait of being good and ethical. 300's King Leonidas was thus virtuous, as were Martin Luther King Jr., Mother Teresa, and the lady down the street who makes tuna fish sandwiches every weekend for the homeless. Here then is the challenge to Mill. Isn't having a virtuous character like this good in itself, even if it doesn't lead to happiness? Wouldn't we have described Martin Luther King Jr.'s virtuous character as good, even if he hadn't created more happiness in the world? Before answering, Mill asks us to consider, of all things, money. Now, I know money seems like it has nothing to do with virtue, and I realize that many philosophical analogies are as bad as a walk in Central Park without a raincoat, but Mill is, I believe, actually onto something here, so let's stay with him. Money, Mill begins, functions as a means of acquiring that which we desire. We see a desirable kitchen appliance at Target, so we load it onto the conveyor belt and hand the cashier a 20. But the thing is, people often come to desire money not for what it can buy, but for its own sake. What has happened when this occurs is that money has transformed from a way of getting what we desire to being the desired thing itself. It has gone, to use more philosophical lingo, from being a means to an end of desire. Now, Mill continues, we are ready to look at virtue, because virtue is just like money. No, Mill is not saying that you can buy a blender with a pocket full of virtue. He is saying rather that virtue goes from being a means to an end in the same way money does. Indeed, we begin to see a virtuous character as good because such a character produces happiness in the world. People like Mother Teresa produce more pleasure than pain, and so we call them good. However, just as money often comes to be valued in itself, so too does virtue. Indeed, we often begin to see virtue not merely as something that tends to produce what is good, but as good in itself. So in this regard, Mill continues, our intuitions are correct in seeing a virtuous character as good in itself. However, there's something we can't forget. Namely, just as we would never desire money if it wasn't first and foremost a means of acquiring other things, so too we would never see virtue as good in itself if it wasn't first and foremost a means to good, that is, a means to happiness. Thus, while virtue can claim to be a good in itself, it can never do so independently of happiness. Mill's greatest happiness principle stands. Mill is thus ready for his next opponent, who is none other than Kant. Indeed, as we have already seen, Kant believes that a good will is good in itself, that the good will's goodness has nothing to do with producing happiness. Well, says Mill, I can't agree with this, obviously, but before we attack the Kantian goodwill, let's get an idea of what the will is in general. The will, if we remember from Kant, is that which guides our action. But what is it that we guide our action towards? Mill's answer to this is, on my reading at least, the same as Kant's. Our actions are typically guided towards our desires, towards that which makes us happy. The will is thus that which acts on our desires, that which acts towards whatever could make us happy. So, for instance, if I desire a couple pecan bars in my kitchen, my will directs me to fulfill this desire. I get out of my chair and go get them. But there's something else about the will, Mill notes, something else important that Kant never mentions. Namely, the will is habit-forming. For an example, let's consider nail biting. It all begins innocently enough. We have a desire for shorter nails, so our will directs us to chomp them off. Sometimes, though, our will continues to direct the chomping, even when we don't necessarily want the shorter nails. And if our habit becomes fully formed, we derive happiness from biting our nails, rather than vice versa. Our happiness is found in the willing to bite, rather than that which is accomplished by the biting. This tendency noted, Mill is now ready to tackle the Kantian goodwill. If we think about it, Mill argues, Kant's goodwill is really no different than a good habit. Indeed, the goodwill begins as a way of acting on our desire for a consistent, reasonable world filled with consistent and reasonable fellow human beings. Our desire, in other words, for a happy and good world. However, our will often continues to operate in this manner, regardless of whether or not such a world is actually produced. And once the goodwill becomes fully a habit, we begin to find the goodwill as good in itself, rather than as a means to that which is good. Thus, Mill concludes, we are misdirected in thinking of the Kantian goodwill as good in itself. It is rather something like a good habit, the purpose of which is to attain happiness. Thus, utilitarianism still stands in its claim that the only good in itself is happiness. The last potential contender with happiness for the title of good in itself is justice. There are a number of things, of course, included under the general heading of justice. Justice includes treating people equally, treating people without partiality, giving people what they are supposed to get, and so on. All of these things, or so the challenge to utilitarianism goes, seem like they are good respective of whether greater happiness is created through their application. It seems good, for instance, to treat people equally, whether or not doing so results in happiness. Now Mill begins. It is true, of course, that most of the time the issues of justice don't need to consider happiness. It is simply both just and good to punish murderers, just and good to share food with the poor. However, both in ethics and elsewhere, straightforward scenarios like these rarely offer any great insights. And so, Mill asks us to consider what happens when our ideas about justice conflict. Mill gives some great examples of such occurrences in utilitarianism, but I'd like to offer you one of my own. Namely, consider the problems caused by Robin Hood. If any of you are unfortunate enough to have missed the legend, it is basically about a guy who lives in Sherwood Forest, wears a funny little green cap, robs from the rich, gives to the poor, jumps fences, dodges trees, and tries to get away. Oodalolly, golly, what a day. Now here's the problem. On the one hand, treating people equally is an aspect of justice. From this angle, it is perfectly just for Robin Hood to do what he does. On the other hand, however, respecting the rights and properties of others is just, and from this angle, Robin Hood's actions are anything but just. They are completely unjust. So how can we possibly decide whether or not Robin Hood is just or unjust? Mill answers that when justice conflicts with itself in this manner, the only thing we can do to decide whether Robin Hood is in fact just and good is look at the happiness he causes. In other words, the only way to decide whether or not Robin Hood is just is to judge him according to the greatest happiness principle, to determine whether robbing from the rich and giving to the poor adds to or detracts from the world's overall happiness. Thus, in the end, justice must bow before the greatest happiness principle. And so, by showing that the goodness of justice ultimately depends upon its production of happiness, Mill has shown that happiness is the one good in and of itself. With this, then, we reach the end of Mill's utilitarianism, one of the great works of modern philosophy. Of course, Mill leaves some questions unanswered, others unasked. We'll be covering some of these in the coming weeks. However, even if we are not able to address all the problems you may have with Mill, you should not hold this against him. For the spawning of such uncertainties is the mark of a good piece of philosophy, not a poor one.